Right here, you guys. President one, yeah, I'm sorry, you got
Yeah, I'm moving over here.
right here, you need to sit down,
Yeah,
settle down.
I'm
I'm sorry, I'm directing people already, like my whole life. President one, President two. One rule here for the next, I'll be up for 45 minutes and then we'll do questions. One rule, I'm going to interact with you and engage you in questions. There's no kneecapping. I'm serious. I'm not here to embarrass you. If I ask a question, it's not because I'm throwing you a curveball, and I'm not joking. So I'm going to play around, but I'll ask a series of questions. If you want to answer, I'm not throwing curveballs. President, what's the president's primary responsibility? CEO, what's the CEO's primary responsibility? One word. Decisions. All right. President's got to make a decision. Sunday night, mid-2003, I get a phone call. It's the director of the CIA, George Tenet. This is all mostly true. Maybe a little fiction. A little fiction here and there. And I was the deputy director of counterterrorism analysis then, which means taking in all the information. I had maybe 400 people working for me, taking in 300, whatever. Taking in all the information and saying, how are we doing against Al-Qaeda? That's an expert level question. Note that word, expert level question. Al-Qaeda's money, Al-Qaeda's recruitment, Al-Qaeda's planning and plotting to create the next terror event. An expert takes in all the information from friendly security services, from our human source penetrations of Al-Qaeda, from our intercepts of their communication. An expert takes that and presents it artfully to a decision maker, because we've just decided President one, and you'll be President two in a second, has to make a decision. All right, here's the expert briefing. George Tenet calls me and says, we have, at that point, again, all true, we had a very good human source penetration of Al-Qaeda. That means a source of the CIA who we pay to go talk to Al-Qaeda leaders. He comes out for debriefings and tells his debriefers, CIA officers, that he's met with Al-Qaeda players and that they say the next big one is coming. That is the next attack. Very hard to get bona fide penetrations of Al-Qaeda. The way we determine bona fide is we determine whether other people are saying the same thing without knowing what our source is saying, and we see, for example, whether Al-Qaeda is referring to our source in their communications. Those are a couple simple ways to determine bona fides. We have, in this case, a rare source with bona fide access to some operational commanders in Al-Qaeda. So again, he says the big one is coming. George Tenet calls me on Sunday night. Phillip, I was in my office, calls on the secure phone. Phillip, we're going to go see the president in the Oval Office tomorrow morning. At that point, the CIA directors saw President Bush every morning. It was at 7 or 7:30 or something. Come down, meet me in my office at the Executive Office building for the White House, and we'll walk over to the Oval Office and talk to President Bush. Okay, pretty interesting. You do the pitch. Cool. There's about 8 people in the room. President, Vice President, National Security Advisor, Homeland Security Advisor, CIA Director, pretty serious audience. We're sitting there. I'm about this far from the President. Expert briefing. Horrible mistake. Mr. President, we have a penetration of Al-Qaeda. We've determined the bona fides of the source because we've been running him for a while. We're seeing Al-Qaeda refer to him, so we know that he's a player within the organization. And we've been able to corroborate what he says because we have independent other sources saying similar things. And his track record goes back for a few years. He's just out for meetings with Al-Qaeda, and they're saying the next big one is coming. Hold on just a second here. What did I just do? Horrible mistake. 20 years in the business, stupid mistake. I took data as an expert, what we knew about the source and what the source says. I consolidated the data into a presentation. What did you say the president has to do? Make a decision. In this case, I don't want to get too much detail, but he's making a decision about some upcoming national events, and he's deciding whether to talk to the American people, that's 300 million people, about whether we should cancel these events. I just gave him a unidimensional presentation based on facts expertly. I did it in 120 seconds or less, no break in eye contact, no ums, and I presented the information accurately. I just forced the decision maker, though, to make the decision. Tell me in about 3 words how much context I gave you.
Very, very little.
I gave you 1 thread of reporting from 1 informant. If you're going to make a decision, one would think it's like a realtor saying, you're new to town, look at Bryn Mawr, here's 1 house. Not so much. Now, if it's a really good house, maybe. That's not a bad parallel. I need context to understand how this house fits in terms of what I like, in terms of cost, in terms of location, access to my office. What I did was to give you a superb expert level briefing. I did not give you an analyst briefing. I'll get to you in a second. As an analyst, I want you to walk backwards. Stand up. Come here. You stand up. Turn around. Turn around. I'm not going to. Go. Come back. Back. Come back. Are you comfortable walking back for a long period of time?
Not necessarily.
Because it's not natural, right? You want to walk this way. Walk past me. You probably want to walk out the door. We do not do team building here. We're not doing that. What I want you through the next 45 minutes to think about is thinking backwards, and you're going to be uncomfortable with it. We typically want to think like we read. We want to take data and present it because we're experts. What I want you to do is to think like an analyst. And as I explain this to you in 45 minutes, that's going to require you to do what your brain doesn't want to do, to reject data first and to ask the question instead. The question in this case is not whether I can present artfully to you in 120 seconds, because I just gave you no context. And furthermore, if you're trying to decide whether to delay or cancel a national celebration, I just scared you. CIA comes in and says they got a great source who talked to Al-Qaeda people, and they say the big one is coming. You're saying, this ain't good. Remember, we're less than 2 years out of 9/11. The president looks at me. He says, so what do I do about it? 20 years in, a light goes on in my head. I am supposed to provide to him not an expert level briefing, 2 words, the theme of what I'll tell you for the next few minutes. Decision advantage. Your information as an expert is not particularly relevant unless it helps you allow a decision maker to make a better decision. In this case, I presented a factually accurate briefing, but I almost gave you decision disadvantage because I led you to believe without telling you and without context that we had a threat. I showed you the house in Bryn Mawr that's $150,000 overpriced, but I didn't give you the context. You said this is an expensive neighborhood. Maybe it's got good light, natural floors, and 3 bathrooms. I'm going to buy it. Bad decision. The facts are right. Here's the price. Here's the bedrooms. Without context, I can't make a good decision. All right. So the president looks at me, no lie, and says, what do I do about it? Light bulb goes on. First light bulb in my head was, I can't believe you just did that. 20 years in the business. And I'm realizing if I can quickly, and he wouldn't have recognized this, if I can quickly spin gears and give him 120 seconds of perspective, the prospect that he makes a better decision is higher. Okay, 20 seconds. Mr. President, you heard what we talked about in terms of the source. We have a source who has a proven track record and great access. He continues to have access. We proved his bona fides, and he says the big one is coming. The problem in racking and stacking this threat is we lack the 4 characteristics you need for a high-end threat. That is time, when's it going to happen? Place, where's it going to happen? People, who's going to do it? And device, how are they going to do it? Without specificity, we have sourcing, that is an informant who has access that we rarely have. But we have an informant that's providing specificity that's about at the bottom 10% of the threats we get in. So until we have a chance to keep working through this threat, we got a mid-level problem here. Okay, stop for just a second. Let's ask a couple of questions. Both factually accurate presentations. None of the facts are wrong in either one of them. Both brilliantly presented by no, that's why I'm going back, and when I remember this, which is about every day when I take out the butter knife and try to eviscerate myself, when I remember this, I'm like, it was a really good presentation. No eye contact. It's like Wolf Blitzer. So in terms of not only in terms of presentation in context, but yours, I'm thinking alarming you, because you're going to say, the CIA says they got a source who says the big one is coming. Yours, I added context, and I'm going to put words in their mouth. What direction are you going in now? By the way, here's the hint. In contrast to the direction you might have gone in 2 minutes ago.
That is a mid-level.
Correct. Thank you. You win. You can leave now. You get a free book. Yes. I make like $1.25 on that book. My first point to you is the first question we have is not how we artfully present what we know about the house or about the threat. The first question we have is we are trying to affect the decision, whether it's purchasing a security or whether it's assessing a threat. So instead of doing what human beings do and what experts do, let me explain to you what I know, those dots of facts about the problem. The first question is, what decision is being made? Much harder than it sounds. Decision advantage. I don't want to hear about data in our walking backwards, thinking backwards proposition until the end, and we'll get to that in about 20 minutes. I want to understand what decision we're trying to affect. I got promoted, 2003. Deputy Director of Counterterrorism, that's 2,500 people. That is global operations, that is taking the guys off the street, the Al-Qaeda guys off the street. That's also what my career was in, analyzing stuff, except when I was just being an expert and not analyzing stuff. But global operations, high-end, high stress. Got a bunch of people, there's financial people in the room, who are assessing Al-Qaeda finances. Remember, decision advantage, expert versus analyst, walking backwards versus thinking forwards. Financial analysts, and I don't know, we probably had 50 of them, 100 of them, they're assessing global financial flows, but obviously assessing them to understand how Al-Qaeda is transferring money. So as a financial expert on my team, you might walk into my office, in this case I'm the decision maker, and say, here's an expert level left to right presentation about how artfully we can understand global financial flows to try to stop Al-Qaeda money. Factually correct, expert driven, data driven, well done, nice graphics. Wrong. If you're running counterterrorism stuff, there's one way that we focused on when I was at the agency to stop counterterrorism activities. That is, take the players off the street. You take the money off the street, I can tell you what the player is going to do. Keep going. You take the recruits off the street, I can tell you what the leadership is going to do. Recruit more people. Take the players off the streets. So, the decision isn't necessarily what you think it is as the expert. You didn't think about what's going on in my brain. You thought about how artfully to present the data. You thought left to right. The decision should be, how can we use financial information to determine who's picking it up at the back end and so we can take them off the streets? Instead of just stopping money, can we use a metric that says, how many financial players are we taking off the streets? We struggled again and again and again to have mission focus that related to the real decision, how do we take players off the streets, versus the secondary decision, how do we take money off the streets? Because the analysts could not get out of their way in presenting data like they'd presented it for 25 years. The decision wasn't money, it was people. All right, as we transition, the characteristics to decision advantage are, first, to find your magic marker. Yes, there. One, obviously, you've got to start at the end. What decision are you trying to affect? Two, you better be able to summarize it in one sentence. If you can't summarize it in one sentence, that means you haven't worked hard enough to distill what the decision is. You're lazy. You got to get down to one sentence to have mission focus. How do we understand financial flows well enough to determine who the end user is to a level of granularity that we can take them off the street? Got it. I also want you to avoid yes, no. Can I stop Al-Qaeda financing? Well, excuse me. I am not a card reader, and I'm not a futurist. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and I don't like expert analysts who tell me they know what's going to happen tomorrow. Is this company going to be worth more next year than it is this year? If I had an analyst come in and give me an answer to that, I'd say, you're an expert, you're not an analyst. I don't know if the company is going to be worth more the next year. I do know that we can apply expertise to determine the characteristics of companies that succeed and whether this company matches those characteristics. I want how questions. I don't want yes or no questions. How do we understand this problem well enough to make good decisions? How do we understand? I can't tell you whether the big one's going off tomorrow. So Mr. President, you're demoted in a second, but don't ask me, is the big one going to happen? I'm going to say I don't know. I can tell you How do I understand whether this threat has characteristics that are serious enough to take action? That's a good analytic question. So no, yes, no, ask how questions. Because analysts are horrible at forecasting. Horrible. Why? This is not a joke. Read Phillip, the best study there is on decision making. Simple reason. If you're an expert on Major League Baseball, and you explain why Villanova is going to win the Big East this year. I have no idea how good they are in baseball. Or the Big East in basketball. I know they're very good in basketball. You're going to want to explain as the season goes on why your initial judgment was right. Human beings want to explain, especially if they're experts in a subject. They become anchored. I was right yesterday. I will be right tomorrow. So they start explaining away inconsistencies because nobody wants to stand in front of the mirror and say, I'm the expert on this, especially when you're paid. I'm paid to be the expert on this. Let me explain why I'm wrong. I don't want analysts to tell me what's happening tomorrow because they're according to Tetlock, this is the phrase he uses, about like chimpanzees throwing a dart at a dartboard. They can explain yesterday and today because they understand what just happened and they can put it in context. They can't break out of their anchoring bias to say sometimes I'm going to be wrong. So I don't want an expert telling me what's going to happen tomorrow. They're going to get it wrong. All right, after we determine what the question is, we're going to provide decision advantage by asking a how question that we can summarize in one sentence. We've got to have in our 3 steps, and I'll give you the 3rd step in a minute, a 2nd step that helps our brains work. That's a big question. How do I understand the characteristics of this threat? You're going to have 10 people walk in and come at this 10 different ways. And if you're managing those people, that's really hard to manage. Here's how I assess a company this way. I assess it that way. Third person assesses it a third way. I'm going to tell you between the question and the data, we're going to apply a process we call, as we run out of space here, drivers. Hold on, do we have another? Yeah. This is my little cue to myself, so I'll forget the rest of the presentation. We're going to have a process we call driver-based process. We're going to break the question down into constituent components so that our brains can juggle components. Because the brain typically can't juggle 6, 8, 10 items at once. It can juggle 1 or 2, and our brains typically don't want to work. Work burns energy, right? It's like a trout. I'm a trout fisherman. A trout's going to stay behind the rock because there's no current. There's an eddy, so he doesn't have to spend energy. It really takes energy to go into the current and get a bug. It takes energy to think analytically and not expertly because an expert typically wants you to just say, here's what's on the front of my brain. Let me tell you what's going on. Classic example. I do this all the time on CNN. ISIS took 3 cities over the past week. They've gotten 100 miles closer to Baghdad. It looks like they're on the road to succeeding. That's what we call availability bias, one of the most common biases, something you see all the time in human beings. What just happened? ISIS has been around for years. We just took one characteristic of the organization, geography, over one short sample size period of time, a few weeks, and we drew massive conclusions because that's what it was available to us. It's front page of the New York Times. They're taking a few cities. The fact that they're taking some geography must mean they're succeeding. That is really bad analysis, really bad. So how do we get out of that? We want to understand, in that case, how do we assess the characteristics of ISIS that might indicate whether they're succeeding or failing? How do we understand that? And I'm going to say it's a good question. We're going to break that down into components. Typically, we're going to have 6 to 10 of those components. I call them drivers because they're going to drive what the answer is to our question. Right? I put 6 to 10 in because whether you're assessing a house, assessing Al-Qaeda, I don't do stocks, but I would think assessing a stock, if you have an 11th criteria to make an assessment, my first question as a former manager of analysts is going to be, really? If the 11th characteristic is that important, why is it 11th? I mean, maybe you want 11 or 12, but I'm saying if somebody comes in and says, here are the 20 characteristics we use to assess when human resources assesses somebody as a hire, I'm going to say 20? Really? Like they don't cut their fingernails? What is number 20? So I'm going to typically, just for giggles, tell you I want 6 to 10, even for a complex problem. Car, house, Al-Qaeda. In this case, if I'm assessing Al-Qaeda in that ISIS problem we just talked about, I'm saying, I spent 25 years on counterterrorism. When you look at a counterterror organization, by the way, think about how similar this is to any business organization. I'm looking at leadership. When I'm looking at leadership, I'm looking at duration, how long are they in power, and do they have expertise and authority? Can they run the organization well over time? I'm looking at money. Do they have the money to operate? I'm looking at recruits. Are they bringing good people into the organization in quantity? I'm looking at ideology. Is their message resonating? Ideology. I went to Villanova. I can't spell. I'm looking at geography. Do they control space, that is size of space, over time? This is important in terror organizations because if you're going to conduct a complex terror plot, you need the time and space to plan. I'm not going to do this as I would typically do in everyday life, but you get the idea. Any time I'm assessing ISIS, I want to say there are characteristics I can use to assess the organization. Now, when we just did that example of saying they took 3 cities last week, and they're 100 miles closer to Baghdad, and therefore I think the threat is high, how many of those characteristics did we cover? No kneecapping, there's no curveballs yet. 1, geography. And by the way, continuing on bias, a tremendous sample size bias. A couple of weeks, are you kidding me? You know what the average length of an insurgency, counterinsurgency is? 10, 20, 30 years. And religious-based ones like ISIS are the longest because the leadership tends to be committed, as opposed to political or economic insurgencies. Religiously based insurgencies last a long time. When you think you're motivated by God, you tend not to go home again. All right, so one key to these is it's going to help your brain juggle. Another key to these is obviously it's going to help you break down a complex problem into constituent components. There's a third key, agnostic. You're telling me we're doing well against ISIS. You're telling me, no, we're not. You're coming in saying, I got 25 years in the business, trust me. I've seen insurgencies. We're doing well. You're coming in saying, I got 3 years in the business. Smarter, he's not a very good analyst. Sorry, we're going to demote you here. You're saying, you know, I went to Villanova, I got a better education, but I can't compete with him. I don't have 30 years in. I don't have a level playing field to have a conversation about a complex problem. Agnostic. You say we're doing well. I forgot who's who, but you say we're doing well. I'm going to tell you whether you say we're doing well or not. Those are the characteristics you're going to use to assess doing well. We're doing well because we're very slow and we're rapidly taking leadership off the playing field, killing a lot of people. We've cut down the amount of oil fields they control, that is ISIS, so their money coming in is not as good. We've talked to European security services and the Turks, so they're cutting off the recruiting cycle. I've forced you to get out of expert level, we're doing well because I've been doing this for 30 years, and to break it down into constituent components. Agnostic because when you say we're doing poorly, I'm going to say, you're going to use the same characteristics to assess the organization. And so when you come in, and I've seen this many times in my career, analysts love to argue, and say, we're doing well, we're doing poorly, I'm going to say, hold on a minute. I can't let the 30-year dude beat the 3-year dude just because of expertise, particularly because expertise will kill you on forecasting. What I'm going to do is say, regardless of where you come down, tell me the characteristics that you think are important to assessing an insurgency. And both of you are going to use those characteristics and give me your judgments. All right, so in the example we used with our presidents before, same thing. I did this, and you guys do this every day. If you're going to buy a house, you say things like, whether or not I like it or I don't, price, location, school district, access to the office, transportation, access to Target, whatever the heck you like. For me, it's a wine bar. Pinot Noir this evening. But my point is, you don't think consciously about this in the workplace a lot, but your brain is doing this already to evaluate a problem. I'm saying make it conscious for almost any problem you can focus on. So when we did President and President 2, the characteristics for threat are quality information, that is time the source is in place, in corroboration of the source, level of access that source has. It's also in terms of the type of the information he actually provides. I want specificity of when the attack is, where it is, who's doing it, and what the device is. I've just given you, I don't know, it's probably 7 or 8. And whether I think the threat is important enough, remember agnostic, anybody who's assessing threat has to look at those lenses. So my first question is, how do I assess in context whether the threat is serious enough for me to talk to the president? I do not want an expert coming in saying, I've got 30 years, don't worry, it's okay. Please don't do that to me. I've got 30 years assessing stocks. This company's really great. All right, it's called VW. By the way, for those of you in finance, I'm not a stock picker. So I told the traders I work once a week a month in Memphis at a boutique asset management company. And I went back to the trading cell last week and said, buy VW. I want a 5% stake by the end of the day. Anyway, we did not buy. So we're thinking backwards again. We're walking backwards. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable because analysts want to depend on past expertise, and they want to depend because our brains are limited on availability bias. What's been happening recently? What's happened lately with ISIS? You know, why did Villanova lose to Seton Hall last week? Hold on a minute here. What are the characteristics? How do we understand the characteristics of a successful Big East basketball team? And please don't give me a sample size of one game. Please. That's for sports talk radio. That's not for analysis. All right, so we're halfway there. Let's start closing out. We are moving this. Instead of starting with data, we're starting with the question. And that question is based on decision advantage. How do we provide an advantage to the decision maker? Instead of then quickly moving to how do we present this data artfully to the decision maker, we're moving backwards saying, I haven't touched data yet. I've determined what my 6, 8, 10 agnostic drivers are. I haven't looked at a car yet. I don't even know if Ford makes cars. I bought a Hyundai Tucson. This will explain to you in 60 seconds why I live alone. Because my life is driven by this. It's a sad way to live. You can sit there and say, how do I find a car, which is what I did. This is, again, why I live alone. How do I find a car that has enough space to get stuff to my farm? I live part-time in a farm, but also has some fuel efficiency. That's my proposition. I'm the decision maker. That's my one-sentence proposition. And I swear I sat down with a piece of paper. Characteristics: reliability, gas mileage, square footage. I had another characteristic. If I can find a dealer within walking distance of my house, live alone, that's a huge advantage for me. I do not want to accept, this was pre-Uber. Today I think I would say I don't care, I'm Ubering home. But my point is, I had about 6 characteristics. It's a Hyundai Tucson. Only one dealer or 2 dealers within walking distance of my house. High reliability. My friends made fun of me. Styling is not on my list. I mean, really? I could care less what the color is and whether my friends make fun of me, which they do. I cared about, I was the decision maker. I set up the decision-making proposition. I gave myself drivers. It took about an hour. Think of this as, in terms of walking backwards from the question to the drivers to the data, as an inverted pyramid. Really uncomfortable. That's not how a pyramid should be. Here's your question. Here's your drivers. Now we're going to get to the data that's at the point of the decision. What I want you to do for each of these drivers is to say, what information do I have, and how do I assess the quality of the information? So, give you an example. Leadership. I would be going to my analyst saying, I want a top 10 for ISIS. Who are the 10 leaders in Iraq and Syria, which they could do? And I want to see a rolling trend line for how quickly we're taking them off the street. In other words, in 2013, we took 3 of 10 off the street. And the list of 10 keeps rolling. Top 10, top 10. So as soon as you take 3 off, you're adding 3 on. In 2013, we've already decided this is a driver to determine, I'm getting very animated here, a driver to determine how we're doing against ISIS. Now we're going to look at the data here. The data is who are the top 10 and what's our pace of operations. That relates to duration. How long are they on the streets? The longer they're out there, the more likely they can execute a successful plot. Simple proposition. In 2013, and I'm making this up, we took 3 of 10 out. In 2014, we took 2 of 10 out. In 2015, we took 1 of 10 out. This is not how I would do analysis. I do this for all the drivers, but we have 2 analysts here. You're coming in and you're saying, I think that we're slowly gaining traction against ISIS because I've been doing this for 20 years. You would accept those are some of the characteristics we're going to use to assess the organization. Again, I'm not going to embarrass you. This is fun. You're saying, I'm not sure we're gaining traction. This is giving me a chance to get beyond nailing Jell-O to a wall. I'm really good at this. I'm the junior guy. I'm not sure I can compete with him, to saying, if you think we're gaining traction and we are weighing the characteristics, the drivers that we think are important, you have to help me understand why we're gaining traction when our pace of operations against leadership has declined. Now, the complicated part here is what we call net assessment. That is, I'm going to do these for every one. We've declined against leaders. They've gone from $1 million a month to $2 million a month in money. Starts to get more complicated. But what I want to do is to get out of the business of you saying, I'm a really good expert on ISIS, trust me. What I want to do is to get out of the business of saying they took 3 cities over the past year, or the past 2 weeks, and therefore they're a greater threat to Baghdad and the threat is increasing. Classic example, I'm speaking at a bookstore in Memphis for my last book. It's a memoir about 3 years ago. This is pretty much before ISIS was starting, but a lot of the conversation was about Al-Qaeda, the architects of 9/11. So we're talking in 2012 or 2013. And a lady in the audience says, don't you think that things are getting worse? There had been an attack in New York. It might have been the Boston bombing, something. So think availability bias, think duration. Boston bombing, tragedy. But few people die. It's one event. She says to me, don't you think that we face a huge threat from Muslim terrorists in this country? Very emotional. Also, this process helps to eliminate emotion from analysis. I love this company. Apple makes great products. I don't really care if you love the company. I want to know whether they're going to make money. Actually, I want to assess how do we understand the characteristics that might define companies that make money, because I just asked a yes/no question. I can't do that. So she comes up after me and she's pretty aggressive. She was in my face saying, I said, I think we're doing okay. And I understand there was a tragedy, and again, I think it was in Boston at the marathon. But despite the tragedy, I think we're making progress. Now, if this had been another analyst, what I would have said was, okay, let's rack and stack this. Again, Al-Qaeda, not ISIS. I'm sitting here saying none of the 9/11 leadership is around except for Ayman Zawahiri, the current leader. Their funding streams are drying up. The geographic space they occupy is getting smaller. Their ideology is getting eaten up because the only person that youth ever see in Europe and North America is like a 75-year-old Egyptian cleric, really. There's a great recruiting tool. So I'm sitting there saying, I can understand how an American, and I get this on Twitter, would say, you're so wrong. You're an apologist for Muslims. I get this. But what I tell them is, we're trying to answer the following question. How do we assess on a grade scale whether we're doing better or worse against this terror organization that murdered 3,000 people 14 years ago? How do we assess whether they're a greater or lesser threat? There's 6 to 8 characteristics I'm going to use. So if you want to come back to me emotionally and say they just murdered a few people in Boston in a marathon, I'm going to say that's a tragedy. That's not a threat assessment. Next time you sit down with a problem, I want to ask that you do a few things. First, I want to ask how quickly your brain automatically walks forward from left to right, like we read, and says, here's what we're going to do about this, here's what the answer is, here's the last week of data. I think you'll find your brain will want to default to a trout behind a rock. Simple reason. And the greatest book on this is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman. Brilliant, brilliant book. It's like taking the top of your cranium off and looking inside, and he'll explain to you how your brain works. It's a little slow at times, but it is a fascinating read And it's all evidence-based. There's a lot of research and experimentation on how the brain makes decisions. One of the things he says is there's a physiological reason for the distinction between fast thinking and slow thinking. Fast thinking is left to right. Here's the bits of data from the past week. They took 3 cities, therefore the threat must be going. It must be going up. Fast thinking. I got an answer, I'm going to move on to the next thing. Slow thinking is the trout going out into the current saying, man, this is burning a lot of energy. Let me make sure I understand what the question is. Let me make sure I understand the characteristics of how I assess ISIS, and then let me fit in the fact that they've taken 3 cities over a tiny snapshot in time and figure out whether that changes my assessment. So let's close with a game. When you walked in the room, you might have said, this statement makes perfect sense. I won't write it, I'll just speak it. This statement goes something like as follows. Mr. President, ISIS has taken 3 cities over the past couple weeks, and the threat to Baghdad is growing. I think the threat from ISIS overall is growing. No decision advantage. What does the president do with that? No assessment of a series of drivers, an assessment of one driver, basically geography, through one sample size of a few weeks. And weighing data based on one variable. We violated 3 principles. We didn't provide decision advantage, we didn't break the problem down in constituent baskets, and we didn't assess very much data. Let's flip that. The first part is the hardest. That's the decision advantage part. In contrast to what I did with the president 12 years ago, I'm sitting there saying, he's got to do something. That evil 2-letter word, do something. The things he can affect, I can think of only 2. American military action, maybe with a little allied action, and support for the Iraqis. Those are 2 broad areas that he can bring influence on. He can give them training, he can give them equipment, he can give them money. He can forward deploy U.S. forces. They're not forward deployed now. So I'm making this up, but I'm making the facts up, but stick with me on the concept. I might be sitting there saying, I'm not even going to talk to him about the ISIS advance. I'm going to say something like this. Mr. President, we've seen advances by ISIS over the past year. Those advances have given them 10% more geographic space. The problems the Iraqi military has faced in blunting those advances have to do with poor leadership at the general level and also an inability to transfer armored personnel carriers forward. If we want to affect ISIS's ability to continue to take geography over time, one of the ways to do this is obviously to help the Iraqi military blunt it, but the other characteristic in insurgent organizations that allows them to do this is leadership. And we're going to have to forward deploy people to spot targets because we can't do that with the Iraqis alone. Their intelligence capabilities are too poor. See what we did? We went from a briefing that provided no decision advantage, that summarized data left to right. We went from a briefing that presented one variable, that is geography, without looking at things like what's most important. Blue team, that's the Iraqis, leadership. And we also went from assessing one bit of data to looking at a year's worth of time and saying there's a whole variety of variables you can affect here. Let me pick 2 out. It took me 20 years, including that one critical briefing, to learn that the only way to transition from being an expert to an analyst is to realize that an expert is never an analyst. Okay, let's go. What are we talking about? Are we done? You guys promised me a vodka tonic. I mean, really? I'm from Villanova. I mean, come on. It's a Catholic school. Yes, please. Take that off the tape. Or delete. No, just kidding. I keep forgetting we're being taped here. I'm afraid I'm going to get hammered. Anyway.
No, I have a couple questions. First, I'm going to go with the theme you just kind of ended on in terms of, and you have been on both sides. You've been an analyst presenting to a boss, and you've managed analysts where you've had people presenting to you.
Yeah.
And I guess I've seen it on the investment side where I've been in both sides.
Yeah.
And when analysts are presenting to me, at times, you always wonder, are they selling their ideas? How much are they selling their ideas?
Correct.
And you're presenting a framework where you're having an analyst really narrow in on a decision-making process. I guess in that process, distinguish between, I'll say, the recommendation for action.
Correct.
And the analysis to help facilitate what I'll call an objective decision.
Yeah, that's a great question. I see this all the time. There's two things I would be thinking about in that circumstance. The first is, can we identify the process by which, let's say we're looking at companies to invest in. And let's say I've got, in a classic, let's say I've got 10 analysts, some have got 30 years, some have got 3. The 30-year guys are going to intimidate the 3-year guys. And also the conversation's going to be muddy, 2 hours long, because somebody's going to come in and say, let me give you a way to think about the company. Somebody else is going to come in and say, let me give you another way to think about this. Correct. Yeah. So my first question is there a game plan for how we assess a simple question? How do we understand the characteristics of companies that we as an investment firm think are important? And I'm going to give you one or two in a second. I'm not an expert on this, but I'll give you an idea. So that's question one. Do we have a way to level the conversational playing field? So when you come in and say, their CFO has turned over twice in the past 3 years, if we haven't put executive turnover, executive sort of staying power in our top 10, my first question to you is going to be, why is this your basic assessment point for this company? It levels the playing field. It also adds a lot of efficiency to the conversation, because I'm initially going to ask the people in the room, among the 10 characteristics we're assessing, what their debt is, what their product is and where it's positioned in the market, what their geographic spread is, whether they have a corporate vision they're executing, what the staying power is of the corporate board. When we walk into the room, my first question is, among these 8, where do we have a difference of opinion? You can really, the second thing, this is really hard. In general, I do not think that putting the analysts in the decision-making chair is a good idea. Because the analyst wants to explain, if they're making the decision, why the decision is right. I don't want the analyst to do that. I want the analyst to say, we as a corporation have determined these are the characteristics we're interested in. I don't have a dog in the fight about whether, so if I'm recommending Apple, but I'm also presenting Apple to the investment team, that's conflict of interest. I know small firms have to do it, but I would say be really careful about doing that, because immediately the person presenting the company as an investment opportunity is going to have a bias to squeeze these. I'm not saying it's wrong. That's the way human beings operate. Of course I'm going to tell you, Villanova is going to have a great year. I graduated from the damn school, despite the fact that they can't find their way through the group of 32 in the tournament. All right, I know that's a low blow. Anyway, yes, please, right here.
You must have to put a lot of the process in determining those drivers.
Yes,
So
great
critical.
question. Yes.
And then how dogmatic do you want it to be about those staying steady over time versus you need to change?
This is a great question, and I'm going to give you a fun example in a moment. Humility is the greatest. There are 2 great assets among many that I think make great analysts. One is humility. I'm going to be wrong. And the other I've forgotten because I'm not a very good analyst. What was it? I swear, experts think the owners of information are the best analysts. I learned the best analysts ever are the best questioners. You ask the best question, you win. I think you have to do a couple of things. One, you have to sit down, let's say every quarter, every 6 months, and say, are the characteristics right? Are they working? So we think these are the 10 characteristics that are best for assessing the prospects for a startup. And you're 1 for 10 in terms of, and you have to have a sample size that's big enough. You got to have the humility to say, we're not doing well. That's right. And we only have an hour, so I blew through a lot of this. Typically on these, I would be adding metrics. The metrics are not the end of the conversation. Analysts hate this. The metrics are simply to keep us honest. So a metric for leadership would be, I think taking 3 of 10 off the table over the course of a year, leadership in ISIS is pretty good. If we get under 3, I'd be nervous. If we get over 3, I'm saying, we're really crushing it here. Now let's say ISIS starts to accelerate the number of attacks they have in the United States. I've got to come back to the table saying, so there's got to be some measurement as long as the analysts understand. The measurement doesn't mean we have to change. It just makes sure we don't have a he said, she said conversation. It's a conversation that's a little harder. I do think you have to do this also because I learned so often that even experts get the drivers wrong. Classic example, again, this is why I live alone. I used to have a teaching, I taught for 1 semester until I realized this is like work. And so I get $3,000 for this, that dog don't hunt. So I gave it up. Plus the student's like, why did I get a B? I've never gotten any, I had one, so I never got anything below an A. Like, you didn't do very well in the semester. I don't know what you want me to say. And then she has the gall to say, you're damaging my prospects for graduate school. I'm like, that's my mission in life? But I was playing a game with my teaching assistant. He had a long tail, he was Uruguayan, his girlfriend's Uruguayan, this is in the book, and I asked him, can I put it in? And I'm sitting there with my stupid analytic brain, this is why I sit around Friday nights alone. How do I assess the prospect that Pablo and his girlfriend, they're talking about going home for Christmas. Both their families are in Uruguay. So my question was, how do I understand whether the prospects are high or low that they're going home? I swear I did this. This is so pathetic. And so I started saying, okay, do they have money, time? Do they have enough break? When was the last time they visited? Has there been duration? Do I get a sense of a soft question? Do they like their families? I asked another geographic question. Do the families live close today? Others they can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So I had a series of drivers. And I came to the conclusion that if I were in Vegas, I'd bet a fair amount of money Pablo's going home. Pablo's visa was running out. Didn't go. I got my 1 driver should have been immigration status. And again, the beauty of those, they're all agnostic. You can say Pablo's coming home or not, but you've got to believe that immigration status plays in that. So it was kind of a fun exercise, and I told him about it because he was helping me teach. I used to teach this as a 2-day seminar. And I said, I got the Pablo question wrong. Can I put it on my book? He's like, okay, boss, you can do that. So yeah, you got to reassess and have the humility to reassess. Yeah, please. I'll go until you tell me to stop, right? All right.
So with the assumption that the drivers all are weighted differently also. There's
Yeah.
factors underlying that they're all weighted differently. 2-part question is, where at some point, expert and analyst, where does gut comes into it? You make a decision based on your gut. And the second is, where do you start bringing in technology where you take the emotional biases out of the equation, you put this in some machine learning or algorithms that will really help drive a decision
Yeah.
based on data, metrics, weightings.
Okay.
And override it with just, I have a gut feeling
Yeah, I've guts at the end.
at the end.
So I want to, emotion in a decision is okay as long as it's conscious. I don't want it at the beginning because I'm afraid it's going to direct the process. I really like this tech stock. I don't care. How do we assess the characteristics of tech stocks that succeed? I'm going to go through the process. At the end, you say, boy, this is counterintuitive. We're red on 7 of 10 that we think are important, but I've been doing, that's okay. I just want to make sure any gut decision is conscious. And this allows you to understand where you're applying bias. I can't take human bias out of decisions. I mean, I hate that car because the lines are wrong. What the hell is that? That's fine. If you said mileage, reliability, color, square footage are important. At the end, you say, this is 3rd on my list, but I like the lines. I'd say, fine, go ahead and do it. You're a human being. But I've squeezed out the emotion into the conscious. You know you're buying it for a characteristic you don't think that's important. Go get that Jaguar. In terms of your question on tech, I think, I'll show my ignorance. If I'm looking at things like margins, profit margins, cost, what a company's doing with debt, I could see having some of this serve as a filter. So we decide we only want to look at companies that have this sort of profit margin on selling widgets. I would go back to saying, let's make sure we have a semi-annual process to look at whether we got our drivers right, to look at whether we got our metrics right. I would also say there are some things we have to consciously understand we cannot measure that way. Give you an example. I'm going to go deep into analysis. Make sure you distinguish when you got these drivers between capability and intent. So, Saddam has XYZ numbers of tanks. That's a capability question. What can he do? He can use 1,000 tanks. I can count them. That's a fact. What will Saddam do tomorrow? That's intent. I don't know. The reason I raise it regarding your question is if I don't know anything about money, and I swear I spend it, but I don't know anything about investing it. I'm going to be sitting there saying one of the things I'm interested in for something like a startup is execution of a strategic plan and how they use cash coming in. Or for a growing company, are they going to buy back shares? They're going to pay dividends? They're going to buy a competitor? I'm looking at that as an intent question. The corporate board says they're doing this. That's somebody's wetware. I am really leery after 30 years of doing this of being too confident that I know what somebody's brain is going to do. So the corporate board has a 3-year plan. I've met them. I've known them for 5 years. I'm always grading intent low. I usually grade information red, yellow, green. I'm green. He's got 1,000 tanks. I can count the damn things. Red, we've never met this guy, this terror leader. We've never had a source who met them. I can't figure out what he's going to do. That's a red. I have no idea. The highest I would ever grade intent is yellow. So I'd agree you can do tech filters for a lot of this, but even when I was doing basic questions like how do you assess the capability of a terror organization, analysts tend to be too confident because they look at what they know. They don't do gap analysis. They're leery of saying this is what I'm uncomfortable with. By the way, a good analyst, a good test, if you have someone walk in your room and they never say, here are the areas where we're vulnerable, you know you got an amateur analyst. Yeah.
Example of the 30-year veteran who's like, I've done this for 30 years.
Yeah, trust me.
Trust me, right?
My answer is I don't trust you, sorry.
The investment business have heard that
Yeah.
story, right?
Yeah.
Number one, can you reprogram that person to look at things right to left? Is it possible? And because I always like the young analyst who doesn't, who's not.
Yeah.
And if so, how do you do it?
No, you can't. This takes a lot of time, by the way. It's frustrating. What I try to tell analysts is I want to have better conversations. I'm not about making you a machine. I'm about ensuring that when we spend your time, it is way up here. So you can come in and say we're doing a grade against ISIS. We're looking at 8 characteristics. The one we disagree about is how significant the rate of takedown of leadership is. That first conversation, I think we're doing really well because I've been watching this for 30 years. I would tell an analyst, that's a pretty low budget conversation. I really want to pick your brain on, we agree on the rest of these, on why we're in a different place on the pace of operations against leadership and how significant that is, because that is way up here. So I think, and I'm a career optimist, I think you can do this by telling analysts, I'm actually getting you to swing bigger on harder problems as opposed to letting you swing low and just come in and say, I'm an expert, here's the deal. Raising the level of debate, I think, is a sales point for an analyst. Yeah, right there.
Just one question.
Nobody left yet, that's cool. All right. I'm not going anywhere, dude. Yeah.
The assessment of the drivers in the financial world, you know, when you're in that world, first thing a lot of us include in our materials is historical measures are no indication of
Yeah.
future results. So how difficult is it when some of those drivers, or most of them, are, a lot of these can be based on historical measures, in a world where we've been taught to not rely on history for the future, how difficult is it in applying this to that type of
I think it's really difficult. What I would suggest is what I call guideposts. So let's say we think that profit margin for the widget company is really important. And I have no idea what profit margins would be on widgets, 20%. And we're worried as experts that we're wedded to the widget company. It's given us great returns for 12 years. There's 8 things we think are important. Stability of leadership, competition, profit margin, what they're doing with cash. I would say what they've done in the past in terms of profit margin is great because we've gotten great returns. Let's not suffer from what's called the boiling frog syndrome. They're down to 19% this year, 18% next year. They lost their CFO and their CTO, but it's okay. They brought good people in. On the front end, I'm going to put in guideposts. I'm going to say, men and women, when we sit down to assess the widget company every 3 months, we've decided that profit margins are important. Let's collectively, before we ever go down the road of assessing this company, ask ourselves one question. Can we offer some rough parameters about what should lead us to scratch our heads so we don't sit there and watch it slowly fade, and 7 years later you're like, man, we missed that one. So we're going to say, if they drop to 18% profit margin for more than 12 months straight, I am not saying we need to disinvest. I'm not saying it's a bad company. I'm saying we cannot come to the table and say, it's okay, don't worry about it. I want future-leaning parameters that force us to get an analyst out of the game of saying, we're still cool, without telling the analyst, I'm going to put you in a black box and just say 18% means we sell. So, and again, realistically, I'm looking at ISIS, or I would be looking at Al-Qaeda saying, what is the pace of takedown, which to me was the most important thing we did. And if you come in saying we took down 1 this month, and typically our pace is 3, you can still say we're doing great, but man, that's going to be a tough conversation. I want to know why. We do 1 more and done? Or 2 more?
I have 2 more.
Oh, come on, really? All right. Yeah, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
It's not like an analytical one, but can you, in all your experience, tell me the decision that you were most proud of making and your biggest mistake?
Biggest mistake. Some personnel decisions, especially personnel decisions where I was not as courteous as I should have been. That's embarrassing. It's humiliating. I mean, if you're doing decision advantage, your question in that case is, how do I pass the message appropriately? Biggest mistake. Oh, when I quit government. I didn't retire. I quit in 2010 because I was nominated by the president to take over Homeland Security Intelligence, which is a low-budget presidential nomination. Although when you join government as an entry-level guy, the president doesn't have that many nominees. There are very few entry-level government officials who ever get a presidential nomination. I didn't know him, but somebody said, you got to nominate this guy. That presidential nomination requires Senate confirmation. You got to sit in front of the Senate on C-SPAN and get your ass handed to you. I quit because the Senate at the end of the confirmation process, which is about a 6-month process, said this guy knows about CIA and what they did to CIA prisoners, and we're going to hammer him. And I said, I mean, you guys have seen me for an hour. I'm like, oh, let's go. Personally, professionally, I'm like, this is going to be front page news. I'm not doing it. That's an embarrassment to the president. I allowed the Congressional Affairs Office to handle the 6 months with the Congress, and they let it get out of hand. I'm happy I quit. I have a great life. I don't work very hard. I make a lot of money, and I drink a lot of wine. And I'm not, you know, my friends ran, so I pulled my nomination, and it was front page news for 1 day, which is the right thing. I don't have very many regrets, but I probably should not have trusted the Congressional Affairs Office, so I lost a career. You asked about, what was the other one, successes? Or what was it?
Yeah,
Proud?
decision that you felt
was proud of leaving. I'm not kidding. You look in the mirror, and I went through this process. This process. What's my question? Is my question, how do I make a living? Or is my question, how do you have joy in life and feel rewarded when you know you can never advance again? Look in the mirror, that's a 5-minute conversation. Quit. As long as you can figure out the finances, which took a year. Quit. Never turn back. I'm proud of that. That was hard. 25 years, that paycheck is in there every 2 weeks, like money. Hard money, every 2 weeks, same time, same amount, to the dime. Quitting without a job, I'm proud of that. But can you turn the camera on? How about some humor? Jeez, funniest thing I ever had. Okay, give me one or two funny ones.
I'll end with
Go.
a funny
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
Talk about the Bush-Cheney dynamic from when you sat across from something that's been written a lot on.
I mean, I only had a handful of interactions with I had more with Cheney. I dealt with him some. I dealt with Bush rarely. My experience with the I was nominated by Obama. I served in the Bush White House. I'm not political. You're trained as an intelligence officer. Whoever the American people elect, that's our man.
Yeah.
My experience limited was that he was more engaged than the public perception. Like the questions he had, this is President Bush, he asked me were pretty good. I did not see, when they're in the limited times I saw him in the room together, I did not see Cheney, there's this perception that he ran the presidency. That's not, again, you're talking about limited interaction. But Bush asked me very good questions. He was very polite to me. I mean, he didn't know who I was, but he also had a pretty good sense of humor. I remember I was in the White House Situation Room, which is in the West Wing. It's sort of below ground. It probably seats, you've seen pictures of it, 12 or 14 around the table. The president sits here and, cabinet advisors. And there's probably 12 backbenchers. So let's say I went down with the director, CI director to, I don't remember what we were talking about, to the president. The president was chairing the meeting. Probably some threat crap. Somebody was trying to blow some shit up. I don't remember what it was. I love how people say, don't you remember, that big threat spike in 2003? I'm like, I have no idea. I don't know what that was. And Tennant and I got along very well. He's a funny guy, again, the former CI director. Now, I believe president of Allen Company, which is a company, what would you call that, a financial company in New York. But he and I got along real well, and I used to go down to testify with him all the time. And so he says, come sit with me at the White House. We've got some meeting with the president, and the Secretary of State's going to be there. Whatever, fine. So the president's here, Tennant's here, and I'm sitting here, and the president asks a question, and some intelligence question. Tennant starts to answer the question, and Tennant and I had taken his SUV down, and we're going to take his SUV back with our escort. And the president looks at him and says, George, I asked him, not you. Can you be quiet for a minute? I'm like, so we get back in the SUV, and I'm like, boss, when you talk to the president, you do realize he would prefer my opinion. It was a hilarious ride back. Anyway, thanks so much. Nobody left? I saw, yeah, I'm sorry, one
This
second.
might be more appropriate over drinks, but this might
Yeah, you're buying.
It's fine. I know the timing, 2010, quick.
Yeah.
But there's a whole movie, right, around Osama bin Laden, the analyst.
I was in that movie. Manhunt?
Yeah. Zero Dark 30.
Oh, I didn't see it. If you watch Manhunt, that's a documentary I was in. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, Zero Dark 30, yeah.
Time on your view on that process.
What process?
Well, I guess you can see the movie, so it's not exactly.
I think he's talking about the process of were there weapons of mass destruction?
No, the analyst basically had a whole case built of where Osama bin Laden is at in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And she go in, and she had to convince every leader in the CIA up to the president, like, we need to go in and take a big risk and do this. And they had to make a tough decision based on limited data,
Yeah.
drivers.
That's pretty much his process, correct.
A lot of it was, the news in this Hollywood, it was gut.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of what you talked about, that was in the movie, based on one person with as much
Yeah.
data as case as she could build.
I mean, from what I know about the movie and what I know about the process, you were talking about emotion earlier and gut. This is a classic example. You cannot walk in and say, here's 3 pieces of information that suggest that UBL, bin Laden, is in this compound. You can't do that. One of the many analytic mistakes captured in that statement is, I need to know your gap analysis. What are the pieces of information we would typically look for and we don't see? I want to know what you're not seeing. Don't tell me the 1 slice of pepperoni pizza. I want to know if the other 10 slices are around there. I don't want you to focus on what you know. My point about your example from, again, not having seen it, from 0 Dark 30 is typically if you're in that situation, you're going to say, here's the characteristics we need to understand to answer the following question. How confident can we be that it's that this guy in the compound? Not is he in the compound. How confident can we be? So then I'm going to say, what are the characteristics of confidence? One of those is video. I want to see, have we seen him on drone coverage? One is communications. One is human source. One is any indication the best thing you can do in that circumstance is couriers. Do we see couriers because they communicate by courier? One is, do we see any electronic communications referring to this facility? Interesting. Do you see a signature from the facility? That is there a lot of phone call activity in and out of the facility? I want to see a negative. If there's a lot of activity, I'm saying these guys are pretty smart. Why do they have that kind of electronic footprint? I would expect to see a silent footprint. So I need to see surrounding facilities, and I want to see this one pretty much silent. So you're going to take those, you're going to go through this process, and you're going to say, we've got some level of confidence on 4 out of 7, but when we look at other targets, you know, because at that point the CIA and Special Forces had prosecuted compound. This isn't Osama bin Laden's compound. This is, we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan going after leadership in compounds for years. So you can say, when we typically go against a compound with a 98% degree of success that we got the guy, we can ping on all these characteristics. In this one, we ping on 3 of 7. You gave the decision maker decision advantage because you told him, in essence, very high risk. As opposed to, you might have come in and said, they ping on 3 of 7, he might say, oh, that might be pretty good. So I gave him context, and in essence, you made his decision harder, but that's the decision advantage in that circumstance. His decisions that was an incredible success. I would have bet big money in Vegas if that would have failed. There's too many. What's the characteristics of a successful raid? Identification of targets, 1. How about transportation in and out? How about there's no local security service that gets you? How about there's no equipment malfunction? How about you don't hit an electrical wire going in? How about a guy gets injured and you can't get him out? Are you kidding me? Stack that on top of 50-50 whether that's actually him. When I went on CNN about that one the next day, because I was out by then, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is miraculous. It's miraculous that you stayed around. Thank you all. Take care.